Welcome to the Dream Novel channel. Before starting to listen to the fun in this clip, don't forget to like and comment, so that the admin will have the encouragement to continue making clips. Let's go listen. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 71, The Happy Pet Owner. The secret passage seemed designed for night owls, its exit tucked away behind some bushes near the Quidditch pitch, just a short distance from the castle. Once everyone had emerged, Fred and George took the lead, walking a few steps ahead before turning around and spreading their arms wide. "Welcome to Hogwarts at night," Fred declared with a grin. "This feels completely different from the daytime." "Enjoy it," George added. Cedric and Conna, both a little excited, exchanged glances. This nighttime adventure was entirely new for them. The sense of novelty filled them with a mixture of thrill and nervousness. Kyle, on the other hand, wasn't feeling particularly emotional about it, but it was still his first time seeing Hogwarts under the night sky. Curiosity got the better of him, and he began to take in the surroundings. Hogwarts at night was serenely quiet. The stars twinkled above, casting a gentle glow that felt like little nightlights scattered across the sky, illuminating the castle's silhouette. The scene was both beautiful and dreamlike, exuding a sense of calm and peace that was different from the bustling energy of the day. They stood there for a moment, taking it all in, until Fred reminded them that they had business to attend to. The group then began heading towards the Forbidden Forest. Along the way, they made a wide detour, purposely avoiding Hagrid's hut. Fawn, despite his timid nature, was still a trained hunting dog with sharp senses. If they wandered too close, he might notice them, and the last thing they wanted was for Hagrid to drag them all back to the castle. After safely passing Hagrid's cabin, the group found themselves in front of a vast expanse of woodland. With Kyle's guidance, they soon came upon a lush wiggentree, the home of the mooncalves. As luck would have it, the mooncalves were already emerging from their lair. These shy magical creatures looked up at the night sky, their long necks extended, with their large, round heads contrasting comically with their slender, spindly legs. They almost resembled mini alpacas, and their awkward proportions made them oddly endearing. Under the moonlight, the mooncalves began to raise their front legs, while their slightly thicker hind legs swayed in a quirky, irregular rhythm. "The mooncalves are dancing," Cedric whispered excitedly. "I've only seen this in books before, but seeing it in person is so much better." "Keep it down," Kyle whispered back, "or they'll notice us and stop." Mooncalves were notoriously shy, and if they became aware of people watching, they'd retreat back into their nests. But Cedric was right, the live performance was far more captivating than any pictures from a textbook. Of course, that wasn't a surprise. Kyle silently mused that Newt Scamander, though an expert in magical creatures, probably wasn't much of a photographer. His passion lay in studying the creatures, not capturing perfect shots. The mooncalves continued their dance, and as they warmed up, their movements became more complex and mesmerizing. With each graceful step, tiny silver-white lights began to appear on the ground behind them, trailing their movements. These glowing specks multiplied and gradually spread across the ground, creating what looked like a shimmering stage beneath the mooncalves' feet. The silver-white stage twinkled under the moonlight, elevating the mooncalves' dance to an almost ethereal level. "So beautiful." Conna's eyes sparkled with wonder as she watched in awe. "Ahem." Kyle debated for a moment before leaning in and whispering to her, "That silver stuff is actually their feces." The stars in Conna's eyes vanished almost instantly. She turned to Kyle in disbelief. "It's true," Kyle said nonchalantly. "If you don't believe me, check Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. It's written in there." Conna. After learning that the mooncalves danced on their own droppings, she knew there was no going back. The graceful, mesmerizing dance she had just witnessed lost all its charm in an instant. Conna felt a wave of frustration wash over her. Why did Kyle have to tell her this now? Couldn't he have waited until after they'd finished watching? The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. She turned around and punched Kyle in the arm. Fred and George, standing nearby, felt similarly. They each gave Kyle a punch, muttering for him to shut up when he should. Only Cedric seemed less bothered, likely because he already knew this little fact. Seeing that he'd upset everyone, Kyle quickly raised his hands in surrender. Okay, I was wrong. But it didn't work. The group continued to glare at him, even Cedric. Realizing he had to salvage the situation somehow, Kyle changed his approach. Alright, how about this? That stuff is silver, and so is sickles. You know what that means. If you're quick, you could probably gather 5 in one night. Fred and George gasped, and instead of scolding Kyle further, they huddled together to do some quick calculations. 5 sickles a night, that's 35 a week, and... Their minds raced. They couldn't keep up with the sums, but they knew it was a lot of money. And with 6 more years at Hogwarts ahead of them, the possibilities seemed endless. Even if they split the profits with Kyle and the others, they could open their own joke shop before graduation. Tears welled up in the twins' eyes, and they embraced each other, nearly jumping with joy at the thought that their dream was within reach. From then on, they ignored everything else and stared intently at the moon calves, waiting for the silver droppings to stop multiplying before springing into action. The moon calves, startled by the sudden enthusiasm, bolted for their burrows. Fred and George, undeterred, quickly began gathering the droppings. Fred even waved at Kyle and the others to join them, perhaps thinking they were moving too slowly. However, Kyle and Cedric remained where they were, and though Conna hesitated, she was eventually dragged along by Kyle. Aren't you going to tell them the truth? Cedric, ever the honest one, looked conflicted. Mooncalf droppings were valuable, yes, but only when fresh. Unlike more common magical substances, they couldn't just be sold anywhere. A stable sales channel and customers were needed for such goods, and Fred and George weren't exactly in a position to transport the droppings beyond Hogwarts grounds. Besides, this was Hogwarts. Both Hagrid's pumpkin patch and Professor Sprout's greenhouse needed plenty of fertilizer. They almost certainly weren't purchasing it from elsewhere. What truth? I have no idea what you're talking about, Kyle replied innocently. Everything I said was true. That stuff really is expensive. Cedric pressed his lips together, casting a sympathetic glance at the twins, who remained blissfully unaware of the complexities. A while later, Kyle began to feel sleepy. He walked over to Fred and George, who were still enthusiastically shoveling, and despite their protests, he and Cedric forcibly dragged them out of the Forbidden Forest. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 72, Why Couldn't It Be You? As they neared the edge of the Forbidden Forest, Fred and George finally gave in and stopped resisting, though they still had plenty of energy left to grumble about Kyle's extravagance. There's still loads left. We've wasted at least a galleon, Fred muttered, holding the hem of his robe like a makeshift pouch, filled to the brim with silver sand. George, similarly dressed, stood next to him, making them look like a pair of overgrown kangaroos. Kyle, on the other hand, didn't respond much, only mumbling something under his breath. He was running low on energy, and the late hour was catching up with him. The initial excitement of watching the mooncalves dance had worn off, and now fatigue was setting in. All he could think about was getting back to the dormitory and sinking into a warm, comfortable bed for a good night's sleep. As the group reached the forest's edge, the sound of barking and heavy footsteps echoed from a short distance away. Hagrid. Everyone froze, immediately dropping to the ground. Kyle swiftly pulled out his invisibility cloak. Though the cloak was a bit small for 5 people and couldn't cover them entirely, the dense underbrush of the Forbidden Forest helped conceal them further. The footsteps drew closer, and soon Hagrid's enormous figure came into view. Kyle clutched the cloak tightly, lying flat on his stomach, barely daring to breathe. Who's there? Show yourself. Hagrid called out, his dim oil lamp casting a flickering glow around him. I can see you. Behind Hagrid trailed Fawn, the large black hound. The dog lowered its head and began sniffing the ground, inching closer to their hiding spot. Everyone's hearts pounded in their chests, and they instinctively covered their mouths to avoid making any noise. Fawn crept nearer, until he was less than a meter away. Kyle could make out the dog's small black eyes and the drool dripping from its mouth. "Did you catch a scent, boy?" Hagrid asked, noticing Fawn's unusual behavior. He moved closer with the lantern, his voice growing more forceful. "I don't know who you are, but this is Hogwarts, not a place for sneaking around. Get out before I lose my patience. If I catch you, you'll be in trouble." For a tense moment, it seemed like Fawn would expose them. But after Hagrid's warning, the hound hesitated, then abruptly turned and trotted off deeper into the forest. Hagrid followed closely behind, walking right past where Kyle and the others lay hidden. They waited, breath held, until the sound of Hagrid's footsteps faded completely. Finally, they exhaled and collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily with relief. "That was close," Cedric exclaimed, his face flushed with excitement. "By Merlin's beard, I could have touched Hagrid's boot. He nearly stepped on my hand." "Oh, gross!" Fred cried, getting to his feet and inspecting his hand with a look of disgust. "I think I touched the dog's drool." "You should be grateful it was only drool," George said, still rattled. Hagrid looked terrifying. "If he'd caught you, it wouldn't have been just detention." He shuddered as he spoke, recalling the intimidating sight of an angry Hagrid. It was the first time George had seen him so furious, and the memory still sent a chill down his spine. "Thanks to you too," Kyle said, giving Fred and George an appreciative pat on the shoulder. If they hadn't brought along all that mooncalf dung to throw off Fawn's sense of smell, they wouldn't have escaped so easily. After this close call, none of them dared to linger. With Hagrid still in the Forbidden Forest, they quickly gathered themselves and hurried back toward the castle. When they reached the exit of the secret passage, the group paused. Rather than rush inside, they pulled out the Marauder's map and checked to make sure Filch wasn't lurking on the first floor. Once the coast was clear, they slipped through the passage one by one and returned to the castle. Since their routes back to their dormitories were different, they parted ways shortly after emerging from the passage. The recent encounter with Hagrid had left everyone a bit shaken, and they were all on edge as they made their way back. Cedric felt his heart racing and couldn't help but ask, "Kyle, you don't think we'll get caught, do you?" "Don't worry, if we get caught, we'll just split up," Kyle whispered. "That way, he won't know who to chase." "But..." Kanna's voice trembled. "I'm slow, what should I do?" Kyle paused for a moment, considering. "That's true, that is a problem. How about this, if we get caught, you run upstairs." "Running upstairs won't get us caught?" Kanna asked, puzzled. "No, running upstairs isn't safe," Kyle shook his head, then explained, "but Filch will chase after you, and Cedric and I will use the chance to run back to the common room." Kanna's eyes gradually dulled, then quickly flashed with anger. Kyle, oblivious to the shift in her mood, continued muttering, "Catching one while two escape, sounds like a good deal to me." Kanna gritted her teeth. "Then why am I the one who has to get caught?" "Well, it's simple," Kyle replied after a brief moment of thought. "If someone's going to get caught, why not you?" For some reason, Kanna suddenly felt oddly calm. Without a word, she pulled out her wand, eyeing Kyle's back as if searching for the perfect spot to jab him. The most notable feature of a serpentine wand is its toughness. According to Ollivander, in extreme situations, it could even serve as a melee weapon. Kyle felt a sudden chill creeping up his spine and instinctively quickened his pace. Luckily, no mishaps occurred, and the three of them returned to the common room without any trouble. Of course, that had been expected. Kyle had checked the Marauder's map at the entrance to the secret passage and noticed that all the professors were asleep in their quarters. Filch, who was on his night patrol, was on the 8th floor. The distance from the Great Hall to the Hufflepuff common room wasn't far, and if you walked quickly, it would only take a few minutes. There wasn't enough time for Filch to catch up. So, Cedric and Kanna's worries during their trek back had been entirely unnecessary. "Good night, see you tomorrow," Kyle yawned as he headed to the dormitory. Originally, he had planned to stop by the kitchen for a snack when they got back, but as soon as he stepped into the common room, he couldn't fight it anymore. His eyelids grew heavy, his head felt light, and all he wanted was a good night's sleep. Good night. Humph. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 73, The First Snow at Hogwarts. For some time now, Kyle had become increasingly fascinated with nighttime activities that nurtured both body and soul. In recent weeks, he'd been sneaking out nearly every night, even more frequently than Fred and George, likely due to the twins' recent misadventure. The pile of mooncalf dung the twins had painstakingly gathered had, unsurprisingly, found no takers. No one in the wizarding world wanted it. The shops in Diagon Alley refused to touch it, but the twins weren't about to give up so easily. Finally, for reasons known only to them, they tried to offload it at a steep discount to Professor Sprout by bringing it to the greenhouse. Predictably, their nighttime escapade was discovered, and the consequences were severe. Professor Sprout only needed one look to figure out the source of the droppings. With such a large quantity, it could only have come from the Forbidden Forest. And, of course, she knew well the time required to collect it. Being caught sneaking into the Forbidden Forest at night was bad enough, but flaunting it in front of her was unthinkable. This blatant provocation was too much for even the usually mild-mannered Professor Sprout. She promptly marched them to Professor McGonagall's office. Despite their best efforts to claim they'd found the droppings near Hagrid's pumpkin patch, no one bought their story. Hagrid had been busy with other matters and hadn't tended the patch in weeks. Disappointed and angry, Professor McGonagall punished them by assigning a week's worth of bathroom cleaning. Filch even voiced his desire to move his office next to Gryffindor Tower to keep an eye on them. However, this all worked in Kyle's favor. Once Mikkel and Ryan were asleep, Kyle slipped out of bed and crept out of the common room. As usual, he wrapped his silver-green scarf around himself, drew his wand, and tapped it lightly to his forehead. "Disillusionment," he whispered. A chill washed over him, spreading from his head down to his toes, as if he'd been doused with ice water. His body took on the color of the wall behind him, a result of the disillusionment charm. Kyle had been practicing this spell since his last venture into the Forbidden Forest. While he owned an invisibility cloak, it had limitations. Move too quickly, and your feet might stick out. The disillusionment charm, by comparison, was more reliable, though mastering it had taken him 3 days. His body's coloring wasn't as seamless as it should have been, but Hogwarts Castle was so dark at night that the imperfection barely mattered. Once fully prepared, Kyle made his way with ease to the library door on the second floor. This was his latest nighttime haunt. He loved reading, but certain books weren't suitable for daylight. They were best savored in secret, alone, under the cover of darkness. The library doors were shut, with a heavy brass lock between them. Kyle took out his master key and unlocked it with a single twist. He pushed one of the doors open just enough to slip inside. The library at night was dark and eerie. "Lumos," Kyle murmured, holding his wand aloft as he navigated past the rows of shelves to the back of the library, where he stopped before a sign. "Restricted section," it read, and Kyle couldn't help but feel the allure of the forbidden books before him. He carefully stepped over the cord that marked the section boundary and illuminated the titles with his wand. Kyle was selective about his choices, determined to avoid any risks. Anything with a picture on the cover, whether portraits, magical creatures, or various symbols, was out. Books without covers were also avoided, as were thick, oversized, or suspiciously marked ones. Anything too old was a no-go. He didn't want to damage fragile pages and risk leaving irreparable traces. He wandered through the restricted section for a while before finally reaching the 6th row of shelves. From the top, he pulled down a thin black book with gold letters, their intricate design worn with age. Kyle could just make out the last 2 words, "Explore." This one would do. As he'd done on previous visits, Kyle sat cross-legged on the floor, opened the book, and began reading. Compared to the general collection, the content here was much denser and more obscure. Whenever he came across something he couldn't understand, he'd take out his quick-writing quill and transcribe it carefully. While this method was slower and more tedious than using a doubling charm, it was also safer. Who knew what kinds of strange protections or curses were hidden in these books? Best to be cautious and avoid casting any spells on them at all. By the time Kyle left the library, 2 hours had passed. On his way back, he unexpectedly encountered Peeves, but thanks to the disillusionment charm, Peeves didn't notice him. The next morning, Kyle had planned to sleep until 8:50, but his 2 roommates had other ideas. At 7:30, they yanked him out of bed. "Wake up, Kyle, wake up." Ignoring Kyle's groggy protests, they each grabbed an arm and hauled him to the window. "Look, it's snowing," Mikkel exclaimed, throwing the window open. A gust of cold wind mixed with snowflakes hit Kyle square in the face. Hiss. Kyle shivered, instantly wide awake. Rubbing his face, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he'd seen this scene somewhere before. "Come on, let's go outside and see it," Mikkel urged excitedly. "This is the first snow at Hogwarts." Kyle shook his head, declining. "What's so exciting about snow?" he thought. "I'd rather catch up on sleep." He had stayed up late the previous night, and it wasn't even the weekend. He didn't want to feel sleepy during classes. But Mikkel and Ryan wouldn't take no for an answer. They kept pressing him to wash up and get dressed, making it clear they weren't leaving without him. "This is our first snow since arriving at Hogwarts, it's special," Mikkel insisted. "Sleeping now is a waste of time, and you can catch up on sleep in History of Magic later." Kyle sighed. True, the first class of the day is History of Magic. With that thought, he relented, got dressed, and followed them out of the dormitory. Overnight, the snow had piled up more than a foot deep. By the time they reached the open area outside Hogwarts Castle, it was already bustling with people. Among them, Kyle spotted Fred and George, surrounded by a few Gryffindors, building a snow lion in the middle of the courtyard. At least, it was supposed to be a lion. In reality, it looked more like a very peculiar flobberworm caterpillar attempting yoga. Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 74, Christmas Eve. Kyle, come build a Yeti with us. Fred and George called out enthusiastically, inviting Kyle to join their snowy creation. But Kyle declined without hesitation. Their artistry was on another level, abstract, with free-flowing lines that gave their work a mysterious, avant-garde charm. Kyle thought, "I'm just an ordinary guy with average skills. How could I contribute to such a masterpiece?" No, he didn't deserve to be part of it. A bit further on, a group of young Hufflepuffs had gathered around the Black Lake, marveling at the way the heavy snowfall had caused it to freeze over. They were debating whether to drill a hole in the ice to catch a few fish, dreaming of a fresh stargazy pie. Nearby, other students were engaged in a spirited snowball fight. Kyle spotted an older Gryffindor student slyly stuffing a stone into a snowball, intending to aim it at a Slytherin. Unfortunately, his aim was a little off. The special snowball traced an arc through the air and nearly struck Professor Oren, who happened to be passing by. "Young man, you must take more care during a snowball fight," Professor Oren said calmly, flicking the snowball aside with his wand, "and avoid mixing in stones. I'll let you off without deducting any points this time, but don't let it happen again." The Gryffindor nodded emphatically, relieved. The students had a fantastic time, everyone, that is, except Filch. He was visibly irritated. The young wizards didn't seem to care much about polishing their shoes, leaving muddy footprints everywhere as they tramped back into the castle. This oversight significantly increased Filch's workload. Eventually, he set up a chair by the castle entrance and wouldn't let anyone inside until they polished their shoes. Later that morning, in History of Magic, Kyle managed to fall asleep within 30 seconds, achieving a quality of rest far better than he'd gotten in the dormitory. Had Kanna not nudged him at the end of class, Kyle reckoned he'd have slept until noon. "Half the students are dozing off," Kanna remarked, rubbing her slightly reddened eyes, as if she'd just woken up herself. Why can't the school just hire a new history of magic professor? Probably because Professor Binns doesn't need a salary, Kyle shrugged. For that reason alone, his position is irreplaceable. Not to mention, Professor Binns worked year-round. Unlike other professors who were often called away by personal matters, his attendance was impeccable. Besides, the history of magic exam was notoriously straightforward. As long as you read the textbook before the test, an E exceeds expectations, grade was nearly guaranteed. Neither the school board nor Dumbledore himself would likely ever agree to replace such a perfectly reliable instructor. That stingy old B, Kyle scoffed, expressing his disdain for Dumbledore's relentless exploitation of senior faculty. As December arrived, the weather grew colder, but the students' spirits only seemed to rise. It was a complete transformation from their drowsy mood the previous month. Christmas break was around the corner, and they were eagerly counting down the days to 2 full weeks of freedom. In such an atmosphere, focusing in class became nearly impossible, and they spent more time daydreaming than listening. Initially, the professors tried to rein them in with point deductions, hoping it would keep them in line, but it had little effect. The students would shape up for a few minutes, only to drift off into distracted reverie shortly after. Realizing this, most professors eventually gave up. They were used to this pre-holiday restlessness. Every year, it was the same. Since they weren't teaching anything new in these last few classes, they turned a blind eye to minor lapses, so long as they didn't go too far. Well, all except for 2 professors, of course. Professor Binns, entirely indifferent to Christmas, continued his history of magic lecture in his usual monotone, recounting the invention of the self-stirring cauldron as if it were a tragic ballad. The self-stirring cauldron, he intoned, enchanted to stir potions on its own, was invented by Gaspard Shingleton in the late 20th century. For this reason. The other was Professor Snape. He didn't care why students were unfocused, and unlike his colleagues, he had no leniency to offer. Any non-Slytherin caught not paying attention lost 3 points immediately. Thanks to his vigilant efforts, Slytherin's house points surged ahead, nearly 100 points higher than second-place Ravenclaw by the day before break. Professor Snape was very pleased with the result. Slytherin's 6-year winning streak looked secure. The evening before the holiday began, Kyle ran into a somewhat frazzled Hagrid in the Great Hall. This was the first time Kyle had seen him since that late-night escapade in the Forbidden Forest. Out of guilt, he and his friends had been avoiding Hagrid for the past month. But now that they were face to face, Kyle couldn't ignore him. "Hagrid. How have you been?" Kyle called, waving. Hagrid looked down at him with a distracted smile. "Kyle, hello there. Sorry, can't stop to chat. I've got loads left to prepare. By Merlin's beard, I nearly forgot Hogwarts is on holiday tomorrow. Seems like Halloween was just the other day." Even as he spoke, Hagrid didn't slow his pace, striding toward the castle in a rush. Kyle had to jog to keep up. "Need a hand?" Kyle offered. "Well, if you're not too busy." Hagrid thought for a moment. "Could you fetch some mistletoe for the decorations? The feast's about to start, and I'm worried I won't get everything done in time." Of course, Kyle agreed, and together, they made their way to Hagrid's cabin by the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Outside the cabin stood 2 massive fir trees, each with a trunk around 60 to 70 centimeters wide, along with a small pile of holly and mistletoe. "Just grab some of that holly and mistletoe, and I'll take care of the rest," Hagrid instructed, bending down to hoist the 2 fir trees. Kyle could see the strain on Hagrid's face as he struggled to lift them both. His cheeks flushed from the effort. It was clear even for him that lifting both trees at once was a challenge. Just then, Hagrid heard a voice behind him. "Wingardium Leviosa." Suddenly, the weight of the trees vanished. Startled, Hagrid turned to see Kyle, wand outstretched, casting the levitation charm. "Blimey! Impressive bit of charm work," Hagrid exclaimed. "Oh, it's nothing, really," Kyle shrugged modestly. "Anyone can do it." "Really?" Hagrid blinked, puzzled. Back in his school days, things weren't like this. Could it be that today's Hogwarts students were all this capable? Channel Dream Novel. Chapter 75, Kyle's Flower Garden. With Kyle's help, Hagrid managed to bring the final Christmas trees to the Great Hall just before dinner. Professors McGonagall and Flitwick were already waiting. Hagrid, there you are, these must be the last two. Oh. Professor Flitwick's eyes lit up as he noticed Kyle beside Hagrid, wand in hand. Excellent levitation charm, Mr. Chopper. 5 points to Hufflepuff. Realizing Kyle's spell had made the task much easier for Hagrid, Professor Flitwick smiled at him. If the final exam were on the floating charm, he said with a wink, I'd give you an O right now. Flitwick raised his own wand, smoothly guiding the two fir trees into their designated spots. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall wove the mistletoe into a hanging garland, filling the last empty space on the wall. Minutes later, students began flooding into the hall, and the festive Christmas dinner commenced. At the Hufflepuff table, Cedric glanced at Kyle in surprise. You're not going home for Christmas? Kyle nodded. Yeah. No one's at home right now, so it wouldn't make much sense to go back. I might as well stay at Hogwarts. Chris was traveling the world with Lord Newt, helping return captured magical creatures to their natural habitats. His mother Diana, from the Department of Mysteries, had recently written to him, saying she wouldn't be home for Christmas but had already sent his presents. With both of them away, Kyle felt there wasn't much point in going home. At Hogwarts, he'd at least have things to keep him busy. He could check in on Fluffy or water the 2 ornamental plants he'd been tending to. Why don't you come to my house? Cedric suggested. My dad would really like to meet you. Kyle shook his head with a polite smile. Maybe next time. I've already promised Hagrid I'd help him look after his animals over the holidays. Cedric looked a little disappointed. Kyle, however, was secretly relieved. The idea of meeting Mr. Diggory, let alone spending 2 weeks with him, was a bit much. Just the thought made Kyle's head spin. He figured it was enough that his mother had to deal with Mr. Diggory alone. To shift the conversation, Kyle turned to Conna, who was sitting nearby. What about you? Are you going home for the holidays? Conna simply shook her head, not saying a word. Kyle took the hint and didn't press further. With the semester over after the Christmas feast, students began boarding the train back to King's Cross Station. Mikkel and Ryan had also gone home, leaving Kyle alone in the dormitory. The once lively common room was now far quieter, a solitude Kyle found rather pleasant. He sat on one of the sofas near the fire, roasting a potato in its skin, surrounded by some flatbread, mushrooms, and thinly sliced beef. When he'd gone to the kitchen for ingredients, the house elves had offered to help, but Kyle had refused. The enjoyment was in the process, eating was secondary. After patiently waiting for the potato to blacken slightly, Kyle took it off the skewer. Once it cooled, he peeled the skin and took a bite. The potato was sweet and soft, though he discovered the center was still a bit raw. Using a spoon, he scooped out the undercooked part and tossed it toward a mouse not far away. Kyle. Conna glared at him. Don't give Pocky that strange stuff. It's just a potato. What's strange about that? Kyle shrugged. Besides, who doesn't like potatoes? But as if deliberately mocking him, Pocky the mouse sniffed the undercooked potato and turned away, not even tempted to try it. Good grief, a picky mouse, Kyle muttered, a bit embarrassed. You should try starving it for a few meals, he suggested to Conna. Conna ignored him, taking Pocky and leaving the common room. Since it was holiday break and Filch's cat wouldn't be lurking about, she figured it was a good time to let her pet explore the castle freely. After all, it had been cooped up in the dormitory for ages. With Conna gone, Kyle was the only one left in the common room. Feeling a bit restless, he finished his food, then decided to head up to the room of requirement on the 8th floor. Over the past 3 months, Kyle had transformed the room into a miniature greenhouse. Alongside chomping cabbage, he had cultivated dittany, rue, belladonna, mistletoe, sneezewort, and even a beautiful golden-banded hydrangea. The first three were common magical plants, and he had easily procured their seeds from Hogsmeade. The golden-banded hydrangea, however, had been a little trickier to obtain. One night, he couldn't resist and snipped a tiny branch from the lush golden hydrangea plant in the Hufflepuff common room. It had been a mere inch long, and he doubted anyone would miss it. To his surprise, the cutting had taken root and was now growing steadily, albeit still small. Kyle was satisfied. As long as it survived, it would flourish. He went straight to the center of the room, where his chomping cabbage plants had grown significantly. In just 3 months, they had shot up from seeds to the size of a bludger, each with a mouth lined with 2 rows of sharp teeth that looked strong enough to snap anything unfortunate enough to get too close. Kyle loosened the soil around the plants, shooing away a billywig that had been buzzing around his head. "Busy right now, go play over there," he told it. A few days ago, he'd rescued the little billywig from Mrs. Norris, who had nearly turned it into lunch. It still had a faint scar from where the cat had grabbed it. After Kyle treated the wound with dittany, the little creature had started following him everywhere. Thankfully, it was well behaved, and at Kyle's words, it fluttered off to a corner of the room where it could explore in peace. The room's spaciousness and the lack of that leaping, lurking cat seemed to be a paradise for the little creature. Once Kyle finished with the chomping cabbage, he looked around the room. Although he had quite a few dittany and rue seeds left, he thought it would be a waste to fill this remarkable space with only the more common magical plants. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully as he gazed at the large empty area he'd purposely left on one side of the room. If he remembered correctly, they'd soon be learning about Devil's Snare in herbology class. Now the fun in this clip is over. Which listeners haven't liked and commented yet? You can press like and comment to encourage the admin find the fun in the next clip. May the listeners be happy forever.